It's been said the Department of Defense does not have a tech innovation problem, right? We have a tech adoption problem. And I think that's really the biggest challenge. This is well understood, right? We have a acquisition system that was developed by, Robert McNamara going back to the 50s that is really well suited toward buying, $50 million aircraft and $100 million, satellites. It's not well equipped to buy your latest and greatest piece of software or a, $10,000 drone that's going to be outdated in 18 months.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of DIB Innovators. Today I'm speaking with Kunal Mehra, president at Scientific Systems Company. Kunal, thanks for chatting with me today.
Thanks for having us, Dave. We're really excited for this conversation.
Yeah, no, this is good. We were just talking small world of all the different folks that, are circling around the defense industry sector and a lot of the things that you're doing, a lot of former military that I'm connected with. So pretty exciting. But you guys have a very unique, I'd say, founding story, your background. So let's start with that. Share with listeners, how did you get to this place of, being the president and, running a great company?
Sure. Well, thanks, Dave. So, actually, this Scientific Systems was actually founded by my father, Raman Mehra, over 30 years ago. And I think, why don't we just start there because it's a really interesting story. So my father was actually born in 1943 in a city called Lahore in India. This was when India was actually still under British occupation. So it was a colony of England. And of course, India got its independence in 1947. And when that happened, the state of Pakistan was actually created. And Lahore ended up on the Pakistani side of the border. So overnight, my family literally had to flee across the border. And that was one of the largest mass migrations in history. So both sides of my family, my mother and my father's side, went through that, which was a really incredibly tumultuous time. Many of my relatives were killed in that whole process. But my father's family settled in a small hill town called Kullu in the foothills of the Himalayas. And, my dad grew up over there. And then, in 1962, he saw the surprise attack of India by China right over the Himalayas, and then a conflict with Pakistan in 1965. So this is a really tumultuous time in India, and the whole experience was just very traumatizing, but really opened his eyes to how critical it is for a budding democracy to have a really strong national defense. So he was always really passionate about technology, really passionate about engineering. At the time, there weren't that many opportunities in India, but he was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to come to America in 1964, and he did his PhD at Harvard in electrical engineering. And, my dad's always been an entrepreneur. He's always been a high-tech, enthusiast, and started a business in the software industry in the late 70s, early 80s. And then in 1990, he founded Scientific Systems as we know it today. And the focus really was on giving back to national security, really satisfying that need that he saw, growing up as a kid in India to give back and to really use advanced techniques in artificial intelligence. But at that time, we called it expert systems. To create a strong national defense.
How was this, just quickly, what was he doing in his background to have this capability? Where did he learn, have those opportunities to even think of doing this? Besides a great idea.
So, he was always technical. He went to engineering school in India and then, like I said, got really interested in electrical engineering. And this was a time in the early 60s where the space race was happening. So, he tells a story. He came to America in 63. And at the time, walking around the streets of Boston, literally, President Kennedy had really inspired the nation to open their arms up to immigrants. So his professors, other classmates, they would invite him over to their homes for dinner, spent a lot of Thanksgivings at other people's houses. And, my dad's a vegetarian, so it was pretty interesting in the 60s showing up to somebody's house for Thanksgiving and refusing to eat the turkey. But, what inspired him was the space race. And it was that real openness in America to open themselves up to innovators and talented people from other countries to come in and give back to the country, contribute to the space race, and then to our national security. So he just got really hooked by that. He was struck by the kindness and the generosity of the families in this area. And so in 72, he joined the faculty of Harvard to teach, automation and machine learning and robotics. Early in his career, he went out to the West Coast at Stanford. He actually worked alongside Tony Tether, who you may remember as, very famous director at DARPA. So he kind of always existed in the NASA national security kind of enterprise throughout his career. And it was always something that he wanted to get back to. So when he founded Scientific Systems in 1990, it was really on focusing solely on how to provide solutions for national defense and the broader space and aerospace industry.
Awesome. And now, how about you? How do you play into this?
So, yeah, well, exactly. Small detail there. So I grew up right outside Boston, and, throughout my life, I always heard amazing stories, first of all, from my relatives, just this experience that they had grown up to, how my family had to relocate to India and kind of restart their businesses and grow. What a tumultuous experience it was, but also how so many of them have come to America and founded great opportunity over here, right? America truly is the land of opportunity. And at the same time, I was hearing how my dad was doing all sorts of cool things, flying out to Langley and to other areas and just contributing to the national defense and doing these amazing projects. So I was always kind of really hooked on this and knew I wanted to be an engineer. So I went off to Columbia University. I studied operations research, and I knew I wanted to do something in high tech and entrepreneurship. So this is like the late 90s. I graduated in 1999. Ended up joining McKinsey as a strategy consultant. That was a phenomenal opportunity. I got to meet with all these Fortune 500 executives and really think about how to solve some really challenging business problems. But, I kind of felt like things were too high level. I wanted to get my hands dirty. So I ended up getting recruited by a private equity firm to join a business they just invested in Ireland, which was one of the really early IT outsourcing companies. So, it was 2001. I moved out to Europe, having the time of my life, traveling all over the place, leading business development. And then 9/11 happened. And, that was just had a real transformative effect. Being in Europe at that time was really interesting. I remember just people coming up to me in the streets, asking me if I was okay, what I needed. It was just this incredible outpouring from society. So I stayed around in Ireland for another year and actually moved back to New York to grow that business. We sold that to IBM in 2005, and it was a great exit. I learned a tremendous amount through that whole process, but I always felt like something was missing. Like one, I wanted to do something to give back, to have that satisfaction, support the mission the way that my father had done and the way that I'd always heard about. And secondly, I found out that, high tech wasn't really all that high tech. The kind of stuff that we were doing, in Ireland was like 1970s technology. And what I loved about scientific systems was like really advanced artificial intelligence and high risk technology. And so I said to my dad, hey, I had this great exit, a risk-free opportunity. I want to come and spend some time with you and see if I can help you guys out. And that's how I ended up at Scientific Systems. And, 20 years later, here I am, and we're still at it.
What a great story. Yeah, it's just fun to hear how different folks come to, kudos to your pops. What a journey. I can only imagine his life stories that he's got from that.
Yeah.
How it shaped you, for sure.
It really did. It really did. From an early time, I think I really understood just kind of how fragile democracy and freedoms and a lot of the things that we take for granted are, and how important the kind of work that you've done and that we do is to our nation's future and to our security.
Yeah, that is fantastic. And McKinsey, I think that's an interesting play too. Talk to a lot of younger kids, as I got into, the opportunity to go work and see kind of at the highest level. What were some of the biggest things you took out of that as you, are now sitting in your current role?
Yeah. So, some of the things I took out of that, one of the biggest things is to really focus on the biggest challenges, most challenging, thorniest problems, right? Because that's really what gets leadership's attention. And particularly now, like in the national security space, I mean, you know this better than anybody. DoD it gets pulled in 100 different directions. There's so much happening just in terms of internationally with the threat cycle and, what countries are doing at any given day. Domestically with the political cycle, the 535, member board of directors that we have in the Senate and houses of Congress that oversee the Department of Defense, that, at the end of the day, it's a really complex environment and it's difficult for DoD to make long-term decisions. And so that decision making really gets concentrated at highest levels in the organization. And that was very similar with Fortune 500 clients at McKinsey as well. The problems that get the attention are the top 4 or 5 major issues that are going to really drive the organization forward. And so if you're focusing on secondary issues, one, you're really not getting after the big problems that need to be solved. But secondly, you're just not going to get the resources and the attention that you need to be successful. So that was one big takeaway. Second thing was really to just focus, with a true fixation on the user and the customer and the need and the mission, right? Because at the end of the day, different technologies, different fads will come and go. But if you're solving a really critical problem for a user, that's what at the end of the day is going to be your real niche and what people are going to pull through and double click on. And so those are some of the great insights I took away from McKinsey. Finally, it's just the incredible problem solving and communications toolkit that you develop, particularly dealing with kind of the most senior levels of these organizations. that has, paid huge dividends for me in my career in commercial industry and then now here at Scientific Systems. So when I joined the company, actually, my early focus was on taking a lot of the advanced technology that we were developing with DARPA and the DoD labs and engaging, with acquisition offices and then eventually with the warfighter to show how we can map that technology into the problem set. And that was where all of these skills really came into play, right? Because I had to take what our technologists were doing and translate it into how we could solve national security problems, which at the time I knew very little about, right? I had to really educate myself and map that in and show how we could fit those mission threads to be able to solve a real problem. And so those skills, the ability to be able to connect what we do in the lab, to how it has effect on the battlefield, that translates very well from business to the military, to national security.
Yeah, great perspective. So pivoting then on double clicking, what are you guys about? What is Scientific Systems? You've thrown out autonomy, defense, like DARPA. Give us the rundown. What is your bread and butter, and what do you bring in?
Sure, absolutely. So our bread and butter really is what we call affordable mass. So we are an AI-powered autonomy company. And we believe very firmly that for America to be, to thrive and continue to be the leader that we are today in the 21st century, we've got to evolve our military from kind of a 20th century mindset that was extremely hardware defined toward a 21st century military that's really software defined. Okay. And let me elaborate on what I mean. And Dave, you know more about this than anybody because you've lived it yourself. But the US military really kind of perfected the 20th century military playbook, right? By advancing kind of ever more exquisite technology that could counter Cold War threats. But we've sort of gotten addicted to this whole playbook, and we've gotten locked into ever more exquisite, ever more expensive systems that really can't address the kinds of 21st century threats that we as a nation face today. So if you look toward kind of the Asia Pacific theater, the kinds of threats that we're going to face there are distributed over a much larger geographic area against an adversary that has a significant home field advantage and has, far greater numbers of systems than we do. So as a result, they're able to outnumber us and outstick us by an order of magnitude. We don't have enough systems. We don't have the magazine depth. We just don't have the capabilities that we need. And it takes us way too long and costs way too much on the current kind of development paradigm that we're on. So this issue, I believe, is really fundamental. Our systems may be very combat effective, but we simply can't produce them in the numbers that we need to, for a major conflict. And just, best examples, Ukraine, right? I mean, in the first 8 months of the conflict in Ukraine, the Ukrainians went through 13 years of Stinger production, right? They went through 5 years of Javelin missile production. So take a step back now, think about this. It's estimated that if we ever were in a situation where America had to defend Taiwan against the Chinese invasion, we would need over 100,000 munitions, right? The entire U.S. stockpile of Tomahawk missiles is like 6,000 rounds. We have about 10,000 JASSM and LRASM. So we literally don't have the weapons inventories to fight one of these wars, and we simply don't have the industrial base to build them. And even if we did, they're completely unaffordable, right? I mean, in the Red Sea, what are we doing? We're fighting $30,000 drones launched by the Houthi rebels. We're fighting those with $3 million AMRAAM missiles, right? That's just an awful cost exchange equation. So those are the Winston Churchill said, right? When we run out of money, we need to start thinking. So what does this 21st century military need to look like? We got to complement those exquisite capabilities with a whole new class of weapon systems that we call affordable mass, right? And affordable mass is all about taking the great, really low-cost technology that we have in our commercial sectors, low-cost drones, recreational boats, everything that SpaceX has been doing with super cheap, LEO satellites, and we've got to be able to use those for military effect. So that's really centered on AI and autonomy software that can push a lot of the decision-making to the platform, make these systems effective in contested environments, and allow a warfighter to be able to control large numbers of these systems in a heavily contested environment to have a disproportionate military effect. And so that's the capability that Scientific Systems has been innovating and developing and now fielding the last 15 years.
So big buzzword, agree with all you're saying, affordable mass, it's good. That's harder than it sounds. What are you guys doing for that? Like specifically, how are you helping to enable these great efforts that I would agree with you 100%. We got to figure this out because we're getting killed on the dollar side equation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the biggest part about affordable mass is software, right? And there's two pieces about it. How do we create the software capabilities that we need to enable affordable mass? And then how does DoD figure out how to actually buy software? Because you know better than anybody that as a nation, we don't know how to do that. So on the first piece, we've developed a whole software architecture called CMA, Collaborative Mission Autonomy. And this is a platform that's really got three layers to it: navigate, collaborate, and orchestrate. So navigate is kind of the lowest level, and that's really our software sits on drones, it sits on satellites, it sits on unmanned surface vessels, and it can process all the data from the sensors on those platforms to figure out where it is, where collisions are, where potential target threats are, to navigate without GPS, right? That's the most basic block of autonomy. Next level up now is what we call collaborate. So that's all about enabling swarms of systems to work together to accomplish a larger mission effect. So our software can enable multiple missiles to go, and attack a convoy of moving targets, right? And prioritize those threats and get the best kind of mission effect against it. Our software can also enable fourth and fifth gen, UAVs to work as loyal wingmen with an F-35 fighter against, a next generation fighter jet from one of our enemies. Our software does that. And then finally, Orchestrate. That's kind of the highest level of our CMA software suite. Orchestrate's really about enabling swarms of swarms across domains. So we've done work with the Army through Project Convergence, where we have, satellites that are detecting targets over wide areas, queuing those to UAVs to be able to go and interrogate those targets, confirm target locations, pass that to Firestorm and other kinds of weapon systems, and be able to take shots at those targets. We're able to close the entire kill chain end-to-end autonomously using our CMA software suite. So that's really the product that we have that we provide to the government as a solution, right? And we do that in one of two ways. Either we work with innovative companies. Zone 5 Technologies is a great example. They're a great company that's won the ETD program from DIU, which is kind of developing a affordable mass version of a missile. And our software is basically providing them with the AI and autonomy that they need to satisfy that program's requirements. That's kind of one way that we support the mission. The second way is we're increasingly working directly with the government as a software prime, where they want to buy the software directly from us, and in some cases have us integrate the software onto low-cost hardware, much of it from the commercial sector, to create that weapon system. So we're not developing the software. We're not developing the hardware. We're not vertically integrated, but we're helping the DoD go out and find what's the best hardware that's commercially available, non-developmental, that we can integrate our software on to satisfy their requirements and give them the capability that they need, do it very quickly and do it very affordably.
That's great. So when you look at challenges in doing this, you talked about across different domains. What's been the biggest challenge that you currently are facing and will face when you're planning this for the next large scale conflict?
Yeah, so it's been said the Department of Defense does not have a tech innovation problem, right? We have a tech adoption problem. And I think that's really the biggest challenge. This is well understood, right? We have a acquisition system that was developed by Robert McNamara going back to the 50s that is really well suited toward buying $50 million aircraft and $100 million satellites. It's not well equipped to buy your latest and greatest piece of software or a $10,000 drone that's going to be outdated in 18 months. And so it's really we're not here to try to reform the acquisition system. There are many other people who are trying to do that, but what we're here is helping the warfighter navigate the acquisition system to get the capabilities that they need to be effective against these 21st century threats. And I think that's a problem for the entire defense industrial base, is how do we help the Department of Defense, really kind of get out of its own way and move into this 21st century paradigm so they can harness this technology and be able to maintain the deterrence that we've had, that's really, I think, stymied, in World War III for 80 years now.
Yeah, I like to tell, well, let's just get there right now. So from an acquisition, you hear the valley of death for young companies, but this is where the innovation's coming from.
Yep.
How have you seen companies, since you're an enabler, I guess you are a prime at some level, for, you mentioned when we were previously talking, both on that, how do you get to the programmer record, and of companies you partnered with who have made, crossed that valley of death, what have been the key things that you think have really enabled that?
Yeah, so I think it's funny, when I joined Scientific Systems, we had been developing a auto router for the Tomahawk cruise missile. And that was actually under a phase 1 and a phase 2 SBIR. And one of the first things that I did is we actually transitioned that into the Tomahawk weapon system for the US Navy. And I remember at the time, somebody on the PEO staff saying to me, holy crap, Kunal, this is the first time I've ever seen something come out of an SBIR and transition to a programmable record without a congressional plus up. Congratulations. And I'm like, what the hell is a congressional plus up and what is this guy talking about, right? And it was an early lesson in just how difficult this is and how real the value of depth is, right? We face that all the time in the commercial sector, but I think it's much more challenging in the Department of Defense, for a couple of reasons. One, just how risk averse the department is, and rightfully so, right? Because we're dealing with lives and we're dealing with really mission critical issues. But also just the bureaucracy and the processes and the 2-year funding cycle that really, stymies things from getting out of the lab into production. Until very recently, venture capital and private equity really were not interested in investing in the defense ecosystem. So it was up to entrepreneurs, like my dad and others, to figure out how to bootstrap their way into a programmable record. And I think a lot of great ideas have, fallen on the floor before they managed to navigate over that time frame. But anyway, I took that lesson, on, and as a result, we've always had a very strong relationship with our congressional delegation, but we've also invested really heavily in working with the end customer to demonstrate our technology in front of them, help them kind of work through their chain of command, through the resource sponsors, through the PEOs, and up through the acquisition chain. And then finally, where we're integrating to existing platforms, you have to develop a really strong relationship and have a clear value proposition to that prime contractor, right? Because at the end of the day, if they don't see you as an enabler for what they're trying to achieve from a business perspective, you're not going to be successful. And any one of those hurdles becomes a filter on the 100 ideas that you have to the 2 that actually make it over the line to get into the field.
That's good. So with if we look at the challenges that the new landscape of warfighting, what challenges that exist, a couple that we hear, especially in the Pacific arena, is the tyranny of distance, obviously contested environments, which that they go hand in hand. But now we've got space, cyber, all the different domains tied into this. How are you guys? Obviously, for you guys to really work on swarming and orchestration, how are you guys tackling those challenges, or how does it shape your thinking when developing?
Oh, yeah, great question. So, and by the way, hopefully at some point we'll get back to Project Replicator and all the amazing things that are happening in the DoD, because I think those are the kinds of things that are really changing the value of depth. But on your question over there, so when we developed CMA, Collaborative Mission Autonomy, it's really interesting. Roll back the clock, 15 or 16 years. It was actually to develop a swarm of unmanned underwater vehicles to create a tripwire to detect, things that shouldn't be there in the ocean. And so if this is way before anybody talked about A2AD or contested environments, right? We were still fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. We had, high bandwidth comms. But as the underwater environment is sort of inherently A2AD, right? You've got acoustic modems that operate at like 300 baud, terrible power environment. Sensors are really lossy. It's a really difficult environment. So we built CMA for that environment from the ground up, which means we knew we wouldn't be able to have a lot of communication between the nodes in the system. You'd have very limited sensor data. So it forced us to push a lot of the intelligence and the autonomy literally to the platform edge, so that individual nodes, individual, unmanned underwater vehicles in this case, could drive all that decision making themselves. And then once a day, once a week, when they could communicate to their peers, they'd pass information downstream to the field to refresh, their information about world state. But fundamentally, they were making decisions organically at the most tactical level. And so, we were lucky that we won that program and we developed our capability there. I think where we were really smart and had foresight, though, is that we continued to invest and develop CMA, and we took it into every other domain. So we're literally now operating from the seafloor to space. And we took that capability into the air domain, into the ground domain. We have it operating on orbit with a series of demonstrations that we're doing with the Space Development Agency. And now, as you talk about the kinds of contested environments that we are facing today in Ukraine, that we will face in the Asia theater, if we ever have to fight there, this architecture that we develop really is a key enabler for putting AI at the edge and doing that reasoning at the individual platform level. So that's really how we get after that problem in detail.
Well, let's come back to the CCA, because it is fascinating, that is where a lot of the it seems, at least my perspective now, granted I'm more focused on, have a background in air type of power, but CCA, collaborative aircraft, a lot of progress there, and a lot of small test kind of groups and opportunities and companies go evaluate this. Talk to me more about that, on how you guys see that is shaping, maybe this acquisition system, as well as being able to get new technologies in the field quickly.
So first of all, I would say I think we as a nation are now finally getting after this problem, and we're doing it with speed, right? We're starting to really build that snowball. So I think everybody would agree that, Ukraine was a real eye-opening experience in terms of really seeing firsthand how these AI-powered autonomy capabilities could enable the next generation of warfare to counter, the Russians' exquisite systems. So I think that convinced a lot of the early adopters that it's finally time to take these AI and autonomy capabilities that the U.S. has been developing for years at places like DARPA to take them out of the lab and bring them onto the battlefield. And Project Replicator, from the Defense Innovation Unit, is one of many examples of these kinds of incubators that got a really empowered leader with a good, with a decent sized chunk of money to work around the system with special authorities to get capability out of the field really quickly. And I think as that is becoming, more and more embraced by Indo-Pacific and by the warfighter, we're starting to really see that capability scale. So, Congressman Walker has been talking, quite a bit now. He's the, chairman of the Appropriations Committee, about scaling, Replicator maybe even by 10x, taking up to $5 billion. So I think we're really starting to see very serious resources go toward filling these capabilities very rapidly and at scale. And I think, that snowball is going to continue to build. And over time, we're going to see the traditional defense acquisition system as we know it kind of reinvent itself in the spirit of Replicator and SCO and some of these other innovators in the department that are really kind of acting as pathfinders to bring these capabilities to the user.
Are you confident in, oftentimes great to put more money, they're just going to be allocated appropriately to drive that behavior? I mean, that to me is the challenge. Yeah, you can give a bunch of money, but then you slip it to a prime, you guys figure it out. Or is it really going to be, focused to help drive that innovation and quickly field capabilities?
So, what I'm seeing that's really new today versus 10 years ago or 10 or 15 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, you had very few new programs of record start. When they did start, they were for, massive billions of dollars, and very quickly became a winner take all program, right? So it really, I think, yeah, exactly.
The next generation air dominance, $20 billion for the first phase.
Yeah, and that would be an example of kind of yesteryear's programs of record. But if you look at what DIU is doing, what I see the Air Force and the other services doing with some of their new programs, one, a lot of times they're using OTAs and these new kind of acquisition authorities to go very fast. Secondly, they're trying to avoid winner take all at all costs. So first of all, we're seeing them really separate buying the software from buying the hardware. And I think that's driven by a bunch of different reasons, right? One is they know that software guy has got to kind of continually evolve, much faster refresh cycles than the hardware. So they want to literally contract for those two capabilities separately. Secondly, there's a huge wariness for vendor lock, right? For these vertically integrated monolithic solutions where you get one company that controls the whole thing. Because then you end up with the F-35 again, where, it's a $2 million change order to Lockheed just to put a new line of code in there. And third, the reality is there's very few companies in the world that do hardware really well and do software really well, right? I mean, look at Apple. Apple's a laggard when it comes to software, but they produce exquisite hardware. So to think that we could create a defense company that could do both simultaneously, I think is a little bit wishful. So that's the first big change that I'm seeing. The second one is constant competition. I mean, we're in a lot of programs now, can't go into detail on many of them, but, every 6 months, they're recompeting the task orders. And it's kind of this hunger style game of competition where, you're in it for 6 months. And if you're not innovating and staying ahead of the pack, you're going to be cut out at the next round of competition. So that is really producing the kinds of incentives and incentives that we need to really level the playing field and drive people to bring their best and open up the ecosystem to many more competitors. So that's the second big change that I'm seeing in the environment to bring in these new competitors. And that may have been, and we're seeing this everywhere from DIU to the Army to the Air Force, down to the Navy, even DARPA is, using pitch days and these really kind of innovative approaches to get people on contract really, really quickly.
Yeah, it still brings up an interesting challenge, though, of the allocation of capital, because to be that company, right? You guys are a little bit different, but you need
Right.
capital,
Yes.
to quickly move it. So yes, you get some dilutive, sometimes it's matching, or non-dilutive, sometimes it's matching. I have seen through talking to folks, we've seen it. The venture community is now backing defense tech, which has not been hardware, especially, but defense tech as a whole, which has not been historically a place to go there. But do you see that allocation of capital cutting off newer companies? Like, are they able? Do you think there's enough for them to be able to get in that position where they're able to compete every 6 months and rapidly change?
Yeah. So, great question. I think initially it was a couple defense unicorns that were really able to tap into that ecosystem. I would say it was a cohort of a bunch of West Coast VCs, that really kind of saw the government was going, what the need of the military was, and really felt some patriotic duty to give back. And I think companies like Anduril and Shield AI and Palantir have really opened up the broader, capital markets eyes to the strong disruption underway in defense and the huge market opportunity that's out there. And so what I've seen in the last 18 months is a lot more of more traditional private equity firms, everything from industrial, companies, PE firms that typically invest in industrials to, cutting edge software investors wanting to get into the defense ecosystem. So, we've had a lot of great conversations and interest, in the last 18 months from this broader cohort of capital providers that is really interested in getting into the ecosystem. So I think there's a lot more capital availability than there was 5 years ago to the broader ecosystem. And there's, a quantum order of magnitude more capital available than there was 15 years ago, when I kind of first got involved in this business and, began to understand the huge challenge of bringing capability to the field.
Good. Hopefully the trend continues. With you guys, I mean, you're unique, more bootstrap perspective. How are you looking for capital? Because, capital can really help large growth. Do you see yourself in kind of a growth phase with your company where that would be useful? Or are you actually very comfortable in your business model where you're not going to need access? Or do you have access? I don't even know, to be honest.
No, so we're blessed. We've been entirely self-funded throughout the history of the company, which has been a great asset because, even 15 years ago, I saw a couple of VC-backed companies come in and, they'd invest really heavily, capture a whole bunch of buzz, and then had a difficult, path toward market and then just fizzled out. So, being self-funded, not having that external pressure has been great in terms of our staying power. And I think that's why we've been able to establish such a great track record in the industry. But, I'm increasingly seeing that there's more opportunity out there than we can possibly capitalize on. For the first time, really ever, I'm feeling like this is the time to really get after it and press the pedal to the metal. Because I think that the market is there, the need is there, and the Department of Defense is really kind of waking up to the need to bring companies like us to the mainstream to be able to harness this capability and get it out to the field to counter these next generation threats. So it's a really interesting time. A lot of companies, I've had conversations with a bunch of CEOs who are in similar situations. And I think we're all seeing the same thing, which is the kinds of conversations that we can have now with capital providers is really different than the ones you'd have, just a couple of years ago. And you have investors that are much more attuned to where the market's going. And I think really thinking strategically about how to deliver a need to the military, to the nation, and make a good profit at the same time.
Yeah, it's definitely a good trend. So it's exciting.
Yeah.
But there's consequences of also taking capital, not necessarily bad, but there are definitely consequences.
Well, let's just remember one thing, with all the billions that have flown in, and I'm sure you see this yourself, I mean, there really has not been a major program of record that one of these innovators has won us yet, right? We're close. A lot of guys are out there chipping at the edge. Obviously, Anduril winning one of the collaborative combat award, getting down to phase 2 is huge. We'll see who makes it through phase 3. But, we still haven't reached the point where the DoD is buying a lot of software on, commercial license fees or, subscription models from, all of these innovators. And I think that's going to be the real paradigm shift, right? Once that happens, that's really when we're going to start to see the snowball effect happen. I think you're going to see a lot of more traditional commercial software vendors also wanting to come into the DoD because it's such an untapped market, right? And if you look at what's happening just internationally, I think that after 30 years of harvesting a peace dividend, we're now seeing a dramatic reawakening of the need to invest in national defense globally, right? I mean, in Europe alone, NATO's has already kind of, I think, talked about or committed to a 3% of GDP commitment toward defense. And you're increasingly hearing other countries talk about taking it up to 5%. So, those are enormous numbers going into national defense that were unthinkable, just 5 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, super, super exciting times. That's cool. How about, dual use comes up a lot.
Mhm.
Is your tech, do you have a commercial side or perspective from dual use? I would think your capability set, what you're bringing, autonomy, the orchestration of, affordable mass. Are you seeing that apply anywhere else outside of Department of Defense, or I'd say the government sector?
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of applications outside the government sector, right? Just think about drones itself, right? There's this huge focus on urban air mobility. So a lot of the systems that we developed, for example, we created a optical landing system for Navy, unmanned systems, to land on Navy ships, right? But you can use that for, the UAM industry needs something like that to be able to land, these helicopters or these unmanned aircraft on buildings and in parking lots and those kinds of areas. You need sense and avoid systems, right? You need collision avoidance systems. For any of those companies to be able to close their business cases to get to, an Uber-like value proposition to a customer, you need an incredible level of AI and autonomy, to be able to automate the system and take a lot of humans out of it. Second, we don't even have enough pilots, right? There are not even enough pilots in America to be able to service the commercial aircraft industry. Now imagine urban air mobility. So there's a lot of applications in kind of niche pockets like that. More broadly, I think in general, there's a huge opportunity as we kind of reindustrialize to bring autonomy to the heartland, right? So if you really think about it, what the internet has done is we've digitized, this virtual world, right? I mean, when we want to use the internet or use any digital tools, we sit at our desk in front of a computer and we stare into a screen. We really haven't done very much to digitize, industry, right? Think about the factory floor, think about really messy industries like agriculture, mining, things where you get out there into the dirt. That's really where autonomy, I think, can play a huge role, and it's largely untapped. So I think as we look into the next decade, a lot of the technology we're developing today is going to find itself into those next generation, industrial applications that'll really kind of drive a renaissance, particularly as Western nations look to reindustrialize, given everything that's happening in the world right now. But we as a company are very much focused on our national security customer, where I think you got to be focused. And, particularly as a small company, one of our key successes is to kind of really stick to our knitting. So the military and national security is what we're really passionate about. And we really view the DoD as the early adopter. So we're focused there. And I think as we get more traction, we'll start to look more seriously at these commercial markets.
Yeah, you got to know what to say no to, for sure.
If everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority, right? So
that's right.
That's the challenge.
All right. So if you were to name one tech, and you may have already, but one technology program that you think will define, I'd say, the future of autonomy in the defense space over the next decade.
Well, I think, obviously the one that everybody loves to talk about is collaborative combat aircraft. And I think that's so exciting just because of the way it captures people's attention. Right. We all watch Top Gun. We love that movie. Everybody knows the story. Now doing that with Robo Wingman is really, I think, something that's going to really viscerally hit the broader public and really transform the way that people think about AI and autonomy in their daily lives. So from kind of a big picture perspective, that's a program that I think is going to just, really have a huge impact on the country. Kind of closer to what's happening today, really, I think Project Replicator and affordable mass has the ability to have an impact in numbers on the battlefield in a much shorter time frame. And so I'm really excited about that. And I think that's really where the future of our business, is tied to as well. It's getting those capabilities out into the field and really driving the next generation of affordable mass to the warfighter to give back that asymmetric capability that we've been lacking for the last decade.
That's great. We're going to have to start wrapping this up, but one last question. If you were to look in the crystal ball Where are you guys in 5 years, 10 years?
I think in 5 or 10 years, I'm not explaining what software prime is. People are looking at us and being like, wow, that system, the scientific systems just feel that is absolutely incredible. We are, I think what the Department of Defense needs is probably a dozen or so, multi-billion dollar software companies that are creating the kind of advanced AI and autonomy that I'm talking about, but literally have our software developers out in the field so that, when Maverick lands the jet and he gets out and he goes in and does his hot wash there and there in that room, listening to what he's saying, and they're, spinning the next software build, and in 24 hours, we've gone through an ATO cycle, it's back on the flight line, and that's what gets flown in the next mission, right? That capability doesn't exist as yet. The tools to do that barely exist as yet. That's what I think the future is, and that's where I'm taking scientific systems.
Love it. Well, this has been a blast, and I could continue this on for a while. I mean, I really enjoy this. Your perspective with what, such a cool company, really empowering our warfighters and the future capability of our combat ability. But if folks want to follow what you're doing or get involved somehow, how best would they do that?
Yeah, the best way to do that is go to our website, www.ssci.com, where you can learn more about the company and our story. And, there's a great news feed up there. And then you can also connect with us on LinkedIn, Scientific Systems. And, that's the best way to stay ahead of what's happening in scientific systems.
All right. Well, thank you, Kunal. Really appreciate your time and look forward to, getting together sometime and sharing a coffee.
Better a beer. But absolutely, babe.
Even better.
I look forward to it too. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you.